Go on, Alex.
Is the intro over?
Yeah, weren't you watching?
But I'm not seeing it, apparently. Hi, everybody. This is Alex, and I'm now starting the show because I, for some reason, missed out on what was supposed to be happening there. Okay, we've been having a particularly raucous pre-session here, getting ready for this. And so it's time that we got to focusing here. And so Ken, luckily, is fairly sane compared to the rest of us. We were being goofy. And he will be telling us about his experience with autofocusing. And so we're going to do that in a little bit here. But first, I'm going to make sure that we all hear about some things that were going on in the Astroimaging channel that you all need to know about. I should be presenting to everybody, and here you can see everybody waiting to present. And if you go to the website, you will find out that we have a lot of things going on. Next week, Brandon will here. By the way, Brandon, I forgot to ask before the show, you're still here. And before Ken starts to talk, I'm going to ask you what you're going to talk about a little bit next week. So just, prepare yourself a 30-second spiel or something to tell people what we're going to be talking about. And after Brandon is here next week, and then we're going to have some other stuff coming up. And then on 4th of July, we're going to take the day off. And you'll notice that on July 11th, it's open. And that's been our next open date for like ever. And I suppose it's time for us all to get to work. And when I say us all, yeah, obviously the guys that are sitting here at the meeting now have to get to work and arrange some more presentations. But you also got to get to work out there. You have to sign on to present some stuff. Remember, the people who are presenting here are amateur astroimagers, just like you are. They are not particularly fancy people. They're not particularly experienced people. They're people that have learned some things that they think that they can share with other people. They pull out their PowerPoint or their Google Slides program or whatever it is that they use, and they put together their thoughts. And they're right most of the time. They're wrong some of the time. They're a lot more sane than some of the websites you could be reading, and you can interact with them here on the Astroimaging channel. And you can be one of them. So I strongly encourage you to go over to our contact sheet here and just tell us what your first name is, your last name is, give us your email, and tell us what you'd like to see a program about. We know that we need certain. One nice program would be, how do you select images? How do you select targets for a night of imaging? What programs do you use? What resources do you use? And things like that. Another one that we've got frequent requests for is free processing software. And I always think of Deep Sky Stacker and GIMP when I think of that. But maybe there's Deep Sky Stacker, or maybe there's, I don't know. See, because that's what I always think about, because I'm old and that's the way I was brought up to think that way. But things change. And if you have been using, or you did use extensively, some software programs that's common as Presource and things like that people can get a hold of, we really could use a show about that. We like shows about an observatory building. We like shows about what you've learned in your first few years of astroimaging. We like all sorts of shows. So please, if you think you've got something to offer, do so. The next thing that we think is important that I want to tell you about is gorgeous galaxies. I know I said gorgeous galaxies when I meant, oh God, not another dang galaxy. I mean, I've been taking pictures of galaxies for the last 2 months or something like that, and I'm getting a little tired of it. I do get to see all of your galaxies. We must have like 50 or 60 of them already. And we've still got, 7 weeks until June 30th, which is the official end date. And you know how we always do things exactly on time. So if you're taking an image of a galaxy and processing it up, please click below to submit, and it'll go into your email system. And you just tell us a little bit about who you are, what you took a picture of, why you took that picture, anything you want. Just visit with me for a while, or don't. Just send me the frickin' picture. That'd make me happy. Okay. And then we do have people already volunteered that will help us put those together into a slideshow like we saw with NeoWise on Parade, or with Orion time. We hope to make another 10-minute slideshow. And I don't know how we're going to do it this time, because the way I'm looking at it, we're going to have like way too many pictures. So we'll figure out a way to do it. Maybe we'll just have two of them. There's a lot of dang galaxies out there, as I've been finding out over the last couple of months. Anyway, send me something big enough at TAIC shots by clicking on that button. 1080 pixels on a side is a good way to think about it. That means it's not going to pixelate when we turn it into a PowerPoint movie. There's other things to point out. There's the spreadsheets here, where you can go and you can get a whole spreadsheet of all the programs that we've done so far. And Wanda's been doing a wonderful job of keeping it updated. We could use some help with other people helping us update it. I also want to remind you that while we're talking here, hey, stop talking. I'm hearing me talk while I shouldn't. There we go. And we've got lots of people already joining us, and we're up to 10.7 million subscribers. Oh, that's 1,000. Well, it's still pretty good for us. Okay. So if you aren't a subscriber yet, please subscribe. And as always, unless we do a poopy job, like the channel. It helps. Okay. It helps in the long run. It gives us more ability to get the word out to other people. Be sure to ask your questions around here. Type in the big red question mark so we can pick it off and know that you've got a question to ask. And the question you will be asking, of Ken here. And Ken is sitting there saying, okay, Alex, that's enough of you. Let's hear from Ken. So Ken, I'm going to stop sharing and it's your turn.
All right, so I've turned my mic on and I'm hitting present now. Yeah. Entire screen. And I'm clicking share.
Ken D is presenting.
Okay, and here's my presentation.
Right.
And I'm going to go into slideshow mode.
Yeah, that's good.
So you should see
one other thing. Ken, you can, down at the bottom where it says stop sharing, you can click hide. No, don't stop. You hide. Okay. And that way that little box isn't there. And don't forget, everybody, ask the questions and we'll interrupt now and then and do what we need to do in order to get the questions to Ken, and share your experiences and make it a really good contribution. Okay. Thanks. Go ahead, Ken.
Okay. So one correction to what Alex said. I'm not going to speak about automatic focusing. I'm going to kind of review my personal experience with focusing, which started off with the DSLR. And at this point, I am doing a stepper motor for focusing. Okay, so I think I more or less have just said this. Also, I'll talk about Badenoff mask. And hopefully at this time, I'll be able to talk a little bit about atmospheric turbulence. Okay, so this is me. I image partly from my backyard, and I go out to the Riverside Astronomical Society site, GMARS, which is where I met Alex. And I move my scope around, which is a royal nuisance, but I enjoy it. Okay, and see, I'm a recently retired aerospace engineer. I didn't do any optics, but I do have a lot of background in electronics, software, test, and integration. I started AP using a DSLR on an Ioptron star tracker. And since we have some Australians here, I'll mention that reason I started doing this is in 2012, my work took me to Australia, to the outback. And I was so impressed with the stars, I was very sad that I didn't bring a camera with me. And then it happened, I had another opportunity the following year in 2013. So I rushed and bought a Canon T3i and the star tracker, and I brought it with me. And that's when I started taking photographs. And I'll soon be showing one of my first Milky Way photographs, which is from Australia. I then started buying more advanced equipment because I wanted to do deep sky objects. And let's see, I don't have a website, but if someone does want to reach me eventually, I go by Ken D on cloudy nights. And I check cloudy nights a couple of times a week. Okay, and just example of some recent photos. I like this triangulum. There's a lot of hours put into this. The trifid is something I did in just an hour about a week, about, I don't know, two weeks ago. It was early in the morning, just before the sun was coming up, and I had some time to fill. So I spent an hour on it. And for only an hour, I'm pretty pleased with how that came out. Okay. All right. So let me get into the real topic here. So why am I talking about focusing? Well, part of the reason is that when I started doing this, I had a lot of trouble with focusing. Um, one gets so used to using DSLRs with automated focusing that you are surprised that it's not easy to focus on a star. First of all, sometimes you can't even see any stars, and you're doing it in the dark, so you can't see the controls on the camera, and you may be using a tripod, but you can't see the legs of the tripod, so you may kick the tripod, and then you're going to be pointing somewhere that isn't where you want to point. So anyway, I started off having lots of little problems with focusing, but I got through it. So I thought it would be a good topic for this presentation. And given my technical background, I actually see focusing as a fairly big subject. You can get into all kinds of things, geometric optics, including the aberrations of lenses, diffraction, and atmospheric turbulence, to say the least. And I'm going to try to talk a little bit about all these things. And then also, if all you want is pretty pictures, personally, I think understanding the technology can be really helpful because it helps you to set realistic expectations and maybe identify how to proceed to get better images. And then another point about focusing is, we know that to get a sharp image, you need to be in focus. But when you're dealing with astrophotography, you're often dealing with signal to noise problems. There's so little light, so few photons, that you really want to get the photons concentrated into as few pixels as you can to improve your signal to noise. So you're much likely to see various dim objects and nebulosity if you have good focus. Okay, so I hope this doesn't get too academic, but anyway, I'm a bit of a technologist, so you have to bear with me. So this is the basics of what focusing is. So I'm showing here, let's start with this on-axis star in the middle. So you got light originating at the star that spreads out in all directions and eventually reaches your lens. So here's this light coming into the lens. At the lens, and of course I'm talking about refractors because I use a refractor. Reflector is a little different, but a lot of the principles are really the same. So the light arrives at the lens with a plane wavefront, which is what I'm showing by this dashed line. The lens bends the light and it converges at a focal point. And after it's bent, you can see there's a spherical wavefront coming out the lens. And by focusing, we move the lens back and forth, or maybe you move the camera back and forth, so that the focal plane is at the focus point. So here's the sensor in the camera. So I'm trying to represent the sensor by this blue line. So we move the sensor back and forth, so it's sitting at the focal point of the lens. And also included in this, I've drawn an off-axis star. So off-axis star is very similar, but I've tried to indicate here that the focal point for an off-axis star is not necessarily on the same plane. And so I'll come back to that in a little bit. So it's very helpful to know how critical you need to achieve this distance. and that's the subject of this chart, the critical focus zone. So if you really zoom in right near that focal point, here's the light converging, same spherical wavefront converging at the point F. But in reality, it doesn't really converge to the point F. That's true in the simplest optics, geometrical optics. But as soon as you start taking into account the wave nature of light, you get diffraction effects. And that manifests itself as the airy disk. And I have the little formula here for the airy disk. Lambda is the wavelength, D is the aperture, the size of your telescope, and F is the focal length. So that's the size, that's the physical size of the airy disk on the sensor. And there's a convention that if you just extend that airy disk forward and backwards until it intersects the light cone coming down here, which is what I'm trying to draw here, it's just a matter of geometry. You get this formula down here for the critical focus zone, 2.4 microns times the F number of the scope. It's kind of amazing to me that it's such a simple little formula. So I think this is a very important result. And see, what's my next chart? Okay, so here's some examples of the value of that formula. I'm currently using a F7, so that gives me a critical focus zone of about 120 microns, which is fairly big. Now, before the show and next week, I think Brandon is his name. He's going to be talking about hyperstar imaging with an F2, and that's quite a small critical focus zone, 9.6 microns, which is less than 1,000th of an inch. So it's pretty challenging to focus in that situation. For my current refractor, just to get a feel for how big these numbers are, what I do is I've counted the ridges on my fine focus knob here, and there are 40 little ridges around the circumference. And when I turn the knob one complete turn, the draw tube moves a centimeter. So that means one ridge here, going from one ridge to the next ridge, is about 250 microns or 10 mil. So that distance is larger, or you might say comparable to the critical focus zone. So that gives you a feel, if you're focusing manually, turning this knob, how precisely one needs to set focus to be within the critical focus zone. And just as a little aside, you might be interested in this. At the bottom here, I have the little plastic cover that focuses often come with. And I did not fully appreciate the value of this cover. Of course, it keeps the dirt out. That's kind of obvious. But what I didn't know is that the fine focus knob has a fairly thin steel rod that's extending from it. And if you bump this knob, you can bend that steel rod. And once it's bent, it doesn't feel very nice. It feels kind of bumpy when you turn it. So I ended up having my focuser repaired after bumping it. The Stellarvue people were very nice with a very small charge to fix that for me. Okay. All right, so I said a little bit about, I mentioned the airy disk. Now, some people may kind of poo-poo the airy disk because you don't actually ever see it or hardly ever see it in an image. And there are a lot of good reasons why you don't see it. In particular, seeing. If you're seeing this poor, you're never going to see the airy disk. It also can be much smaller than your pixels, so it's not going to be resolved. And of course, we usually don't image in monochromatic light. We have a mixture of different wavelengths. And the location of these dark rings depend upon wavelengths. So when you have a mixture of different wavelengths, the bright rings and the dark rings will overlap and everything will average out. But it is there, and you can see it. So this is actually a photograph I took with my scope of the airy disk. And I did this kind of a trick. I put a little aperture mask over the scope. So instead of, I usually use a 4-inch refractor. So with the aperture mask, I reduced it to 1 inch, which makes the airy disc 4 times larger. And it was just barely resolvable. Okay. All right, and then again, maybe a little too academic, but bear with me for a while. What is diffraction? So I've got a little diagram here. AB is supposed to be the objective lens, the big lens at the front of the telescope, extends across here. And C is an on-axis point along the optical axis. So at each point along the lens, you have light coming out. And if you consider 2 points on a diameter that are equally spaced from the center, the distance from A to C and the distance from B to C is the same. So that when you have a wave that's oscillating, traveling down here, and the same another wave traveling down here, if they're in phase, in other words, you have a planar wavefront in front, they're going to be in phase at C. So the crests of the wave align, and you'll end up with a bright spot right at point C. But then if you consider an off-axis point, such as D, again, you got rays of light originating from A and B, but you notice that the path lengths, B, D, and AD are different. AD is longer, so that when the light reaches D, these two paths are going to be at a different phase, and you're not going to get as bright a spot. And a certain angle, as you move down here at a certain angle, the crest and the trowel of the wave will align, and in fact, they'll cancel out, and you'll get a dark spot. And that's true if you all the way around. So you actually get a ring of dark spots. So all this was figured out. The exact mathematical formula was first obtained by Sir George Airy. I always knew it was the Airy disk, but when I looked this up, I didn't realize that he was actually the English Astronomer Royal in 1835. I was first going to write that George Airy, the physicist, figured this out, but he was actually an astronomer. All right, so on to my DSLR efforts. I already told you a little bit about this, but this was the system I took with me to Australia. And here's my first Milky Way image. This was, I think it was a single exposure, about 30 seconds. So how do you focus with a DSLR? Well, first of all, you need to use manual mode because the light just isn't enough to use the automatic focus. Select some bright source. It could be a bright star or maybe a distant street lamp if you're in some urban area. You use live view to get continuous feedback. And then digital zoom. Zoom in as much as you can on that bright source. And then, of course, you adjust the lens to get that image as small as possible. And then some of the problems I've had is that once I've adjusted it, at least the lenses I have, which aren't the most expensive ones, the focus rings seem kind of loose. And even though I adjusted it, it seems like they have ways of moving away from my position. So you got to be very careful when you move the camera back to whatever you want to photograph, that you don't tweak the focus. And then another problem I ran into is dew. I live near the coast in California, and we get a lot of fog and dew at night. And so because of all these difficulties, it helps a lot to practice in daylight before you go out in the dark and start doing this. Okay, so after doing some constellations and Milky Way photos, I got interested in doing some deep sky objects. I was having a lot of trouble. I started using a 300 millimeter lens, and I remember trying to take a picture of M31, and I spent more time trying to trying to get that galaxy in my camera than anything else. So I got sick of doing that, and I decided I've got to get a mount. And I bought both a mount and a telescope on cloudy nights around 2015. And you can see here the back end of this. So this is the Orion EDT carbon fiber. Here's my DSLR sitting here. And at some point soon after that, I added a guide scope. So that's what this is up here. All right. So focusing with the DSLR on the Orion was basically exactly the same thing as focusing on a star tracker. Same process. It was a very smooth transition for me. It was a little hard initially using the star tracker, but once I got that down pretty well, it was easy to move to the DSLR and telescope. But I then began to become disappointed with the performance of the Canon camera. It's a very nice camera, and I know people sometimes modify the cameras to improve the sensitivity, the red light, but I liked the camera. I used it for other purposes, so I didn't want to modify it. And I decided to go and buy a CCD camera. And so now you see the CCD camera sitting down here at the back of the scope. And again, this focusing scheme is pretty much the same, at least for me initially. You got to slew to a bright star and then turn the focus knob to make that star as small as possible. The complication with one of these older CCD cameras is that it's much slower than DSLR. There isn't any kind of video mode. In fact, this particular camera, for the highest resolution, it takes about 10 seconds to download an image. So you're sitting there, you tweak your focus knob, you wait 10 seconds, an image comes in. You turn the focus knob, you wait another 10 seconds. So it takes a lot of patience to try to focus this. There is a region of interest feature, so you can narrow down the size of the frame, and so that will greatly speed up the download time, but it's still quite painful to be focusing this way. And I'm also mentioning here a couple of other issues I had when I started to use the the CCD camera. That it's considerably heavier than the Canon, 3.5 pounds versus 1 pound. The 3.5 pounds includes the filter wheel right here. And I discovered the focuser started slipping. So once I went to the trouble of focusing, I discovered, a few hours later, the drawer tube had slipped and I wasn't in focus anymore. And then another issue is I think I was beginning to have a certain amount of sag on the drawer tube from the weight of the camera. All right, so I'm now going to talk a little bit more about the field flattener. So when I bought that Orion scope, I was kind of lucky because I really didn't know what I was doing. I just wanted to get a telescope, and the guy I bought it from, he provided it with a field flattener and also the T-ring adapter to the DSLR. So that was very helpful for me, but it introduced me to this concept of back focus. So what I'm showing here is the back end of the Orion. No, actually, this is not the Orion. This is my current scope. It doesn't matter. This is the back end showing this is the compression ring that holds the field flattener to the scope. This section here is the field flattener. Then there's a little spacer here, the filter wheel and the camera. So by design, you need to get, usually it's 55 millimeters from the back edge of the field flattener to the sensor, which is inside the camera. And when I started doing this, I had 3 different extenders here. I had a 5, 10, and 25 millimeter piece. That's a little kit that Orion sells. When I calculated the distance, I just figured it should be about 18. So I put together the 5 and 10 and started using it, even though I knew it was a little short, and it seemed to work pretty well. But even at 15, but it always bothered me that I wasn't at exactly the 18 millimeters I calculated. So after doing that for a while, I decided, what the heck, I'm gonna try putting in these little thin plastic spacers to see if I could tweak the distance up to the number that I thought it should be. And I was kind of surprised that I never saw a dramatic change. So it seems like it's not particularly sensitive. I've never seen any theory, any simple expression that tells you how sensitive this setting is. If anyone knows about that, I'd love to hear about it. But just as an experiment to see if I could deliberately make it bad. About a month ago, I took out those the 5 + 10 millimeter extension tubes, and I put in the 25 millimeter tube. And very much to my surprise, rather than getting worse, it actually got a little bit better. So I'm rather confused about that, but at the moment I still have my 25 millimeter extension tube in there, and it still seems to be working. What I did notice is that there was a bit more vignetting, that around the edges of the image it was a bit darker. That's not really a problem, since that can be corrected with flat frames. So let's see what I have here. Oh, okay. And if you don't believe me, here are two images that I took with the two different extension tubes, 15 millimeters and 25 millimeters. So this is using a tool in PixInsight called the aberration spotter. It takes an image and it breaks it up into sub panels, so you could easily compare the center with the edges. So you can see here with the 15 millimeter extension, I got reasonably small stars out to the edges, about the same as in the center. So it's a reasonably flat field. And when I went to 25, well, it's kind of the same story. I don't really see an enormous change. Now, maybe I'm just not sensitive enough. And maybe if I went in there and I did a lot of pixel peaking, I'd see a little effect, but it certainly seems like it's pretty small. Right. Then I also started mentioning problems I had with the focuser when I went to a heavier CCD camera. So what I've done here, this is a picture of the Crayford focuser that comes with the Orion scope. It's rated for 6 pounds, according to the advertisement for it. And I bought it used, and I've used it for many years now, and maybe I've abused it a little bit, but at this point, it certainly doesn't support 6 pounds. I took it apart to see if there's anything obviously wrong with it, because at some point it got really bad. And I did discover that, well, first let me describe what is a Crayford focuser. So the way I look at it is there's a little, you can't see it here, but there's a little screw that comes in from underneath. And that screw normally pushes against this little Teflon spacer. The Teflon spacer has a groove across the top that kind of cups the axle. So when you tighten the screw, it pushes the axle up a little bit, and the axle pushes down against this metal plate on the bottom of the draw tube. So when you tighten the screw, it pushes the axle, pushes the draw tube, and then the draw tube pushes against 4 roller bearings. You can kind of see one here and maybe the other one here. So when I took this apart, much to my surprise, I found the housing of one of these roller bearings was cracked. That may be that I gradually was increasing the tension more and more to prevent the focus tube from sliding, and it ended up cracking the roller bearing. So I replaced the bearing. That was It was very easy to do. I also contacted Orion. I was wondering if they would give me another piece of Teflon, because I think over the years the Teflon had gotten distorted. But I discovered that Orion doesn't seem to want to deal with people who buy used equipment. They wanted the original purchase receipt, and so they wouldn't supply any spare parts. I know some people end up replacing this focuser with a moonlight focuser, and I may end up doing that eventually, but for many reasons, I ended up just going to a different scope with a heftier focuser. All right. After struggling with the focuser slipping and having so much trouble with that, I decided, well, let me try a batten-off mask, because after reading about this, I learned that if you use it optimally, I felt that I could probably achieve focus much faster. And I'll describe how that's done. So the batten-off mask, this particular one is a 3D printed mask, and there was a presentation a couple of weeks ago on 3D printing. This is based on diffraction. On the right is the image of a star that you get when the batten-off mask is placed at the top of the scope. The lower half of the mask is responsible for the spike through the middle here. And then the right side is responsible for the spike down like this. You can see the spikes are always perpendicular to the slots. And then we have this spike perpendicular to these slots. So the way this works, at least the way I think it works, is up at the top of the scope, the spike caused by these slots is as shown here, kind of at the bottom of the converging light cone. And the spikes caused by these slots are at the top, the vertical, the upper side of the converging light cone. But then as the light approaches the focal plane, the top and bottom come together. And when you're exactly in focus, these spikes converge and they look like this. And then when you go beyond focus, the spike from here starts moving to the top side of the, now it's the diverging light cone. So to focus, you basically adjust your focus knob and put this horizontal spike right in the middle here. And I also want to point out off to the side of the photograph, you can see these little dimmer stars. So this is a very bright star, and if you want to see these spikes with a reasonably short exposure, you have to use a bright star. Otherwise, you just get these little things, and that doesn't help very much. All right, so just to kind of repeat some of what I said. This how do you focus with a batten-off mask? Well, first you got to slew to a bright star. You have to remember to place the mask over the scope. You got to take many short exposures, turning your focus knob until the horizontal spike is right between the diagonal spikes. One nice thing about this is that there's no need to go beyond optimal focus. So if you're doing this by just eyeballing the size of the image, I know I have a tendency to make the image small and then go a little bit further, see it start growing again, and then backing up to make sure I got the smallest star. But with the batten-off mask, you know when you're in the center, you know that when that horizontal spike is right between the two diagonal ones. So there's no need to go beyond focus. And then once you do focus, of course, you got to remember to take the mask off and then slew back to the target. Now there's a software tool called the batten-off grabber, which helps quantify, if you're into that, exactly how accurately you're focused. So I have on the left side here, this is the little standalone version of the batten-off grabber. the way this works is you take your image and you put your mouse at the center and kind of drag outward, and a little square appears over the image. And it seems like this guy then does a screen capture and it reproduces your photograph in its own window. And at that point, it finds the spikes and will attempts to calculate how accurately you're focused. So in this case, it's claiming I'm off by 21 microns and I'm well within the critical focus zone for my scope. Okay. Now I began to wonder how does this thing calculate that 21 microns from a screen capture? Because it seemed to me that there's some extra parameter that you don't enter. To use it, you enter the scope aperture, focal length, and pixel size. They're up at the upper left here. You can see focal length, aperture, and pixel size. But when you do a screen capture, or you can expand this image arbitrarily, it seemed like, how does it know what the scale here is? So let's see, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. So what I did is, now that I have a stepper motor on my focuser, I use the stepper motor to move in and out a precise amount. And for each of these 4 different positions, I wrote down what the Batenoff grabber was reporting as how far out of focus I was. Both of these scales are effectively in microns. This comes right off the Batenoff grabber software. This is actually the stepper position for my focus motor, but it turns out that this is essentially in microns too. So when you do this graph, you'd expect a slope of 1, that 1 micron here should be 1 micron there, but it turns out I got 0.22. So it looks like there's some kind of scaling error on that piece of software, that it's not 1 micron to 1 micron. But nevertheless, I do find it very useful. And with a little practice, I see I misspelled practice here. With a little practice, if you orient the Bahtinov mask consistently, what I do is I kind of point the V's toward the counterweights on the scope. It turns out that that horizontal spike will be consistently above or below the others, depending whether your focus is above or below the focal plane. So you can tell at a glance which direction you need to turn the focuser. And then also, because the position of that horizontal spike is proportional to how out of focus you are, you begin to get a sense of how much you need to turn the focus knob to bring it into focus. So I found with some practice that with only maybe 2 or 3 twists in my focus knob, as long as I was close to begin with, I could bring it into focus. So I'm a pretty much an advocate of these Bahtinov masks. They seem to work really well.
Ken, do you have time for a couple of questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, let me just see. Why did you not use the APT Bahtinov focus tool?
Okay, so in fact, I did when I started. I didn't mention this, but when I started using the Orion scope with the DSL camera, I started looking for software, and APT is a free data acquisition program, and I started using that, and I had a lot of good experience with it. And I did use the embedded Bahtinov tool in it. I was always a little puzzled what the number meant. My recollection is it's not really identified. It shows that distance it wasn't clear whether it's pixels or microns that it's reporting. I did send an inquiry to the author of APT, but I never got a response back. But nevertheless, APT I found to be a very useful tool. The reason I'm not showing it here is that I recently moved to a different data acquisition program. I'm now using Sequence Generator Pro, and I wanted to continue to have the ability to use the Batinoff mask and to use the Batinoff grabber. So I was able to find a standalone version of it. I'm guessing that the author of APT has integrated this same software into APT, but I don't really know that's the case. So
we have another question.
Okay.
Do you have any comments on sampling, arc seconds per pixel on the effect of the focuser on the focus?
Well, on the effect of the focuser.
Or the effect,
I'm hoping
on the best focus.
Well, I'm hoping to spend a little time talking about seeing a bit later, but my experience has always been in sites that have relatively poor seeing, like 3+ arc seconds. The scope I'm using right now is about 1.5 arc seconds per pixel, so I get about two pixels on a star if I'm binning one by one. And that seems to be pretty good. I get some pretty good images. I can't say I've explored, it seems to me to be pretty hard to explore a range of arc seconds per pixel unless you change your hardware a lot, and that gets really expensive. So at least at the image scale that I use, I get some really sharp little stars. I don't know if that answers the question.
I have one more question. You have a fairly short focal length telescope, but if you have a longer focal length telescope, it's really worthwhile to calculate exactly how many steps are within your critical focus zone, so you don't spend a lot of time trying to get more and more focus when you're well within the critical focus zones.
Oh, yes,
as far as kind of steps.
Yes, I completely agree. In fact, I should have made that point. One of the values of knowing that critical focus zone is so you have a sense of how hard you should focus. It's clearly diminishing returns, right? If you don't need to be exactly in the center, and unless that's your nature, right? The benefit is pretty minor or the loss of focus it degrades gradually as you move away from the absolute point.
And we always have to deal with the fact that imaging changes and it isn't perfect even at that moment that you're doing the focus.
Correct.
So trying to keep tweaking and tweaking and tweaking when you're basically right around the critical focus zone, it can be a waste of time if you're doing it the way you described.
Yes. The reason I brought up the tweaking problem, I think it turned out to be the mechanical problems with the focuser, that I focus and then it seemed to move, and I focus again and it would move. So I found myself tweaking. But yeah, I think I agree with you completely that there's diminishing returns.
I think that's all we got for now. Go ahead.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to move on to now the stepper motor. So a few months ago, I finally bought myself a stepper motor, and that is quite a luxury. It's just wonderful. I didn't buy this originally because I figured, I don't know how serious I am about all this. It's not that much trouble to get up and turn the focus knob and sit back down again. But once you start imaging overnight and slewing to multiple targets overnight, it's really pretty impractical to do this manually. I know I started getting lazy. I ended up focusing only a couple of times, even though I was running all night. And then you worry about, well, are your images all ruined because their focus is drifting? So once you get into imaging that way, I kind of feel that motorizing your focuser is absolutely necessary. Then, of course, filters may not be perfectly parfocal. I do, it's a mono camera, so I rotate through different filters, and they're pretty close, but it's nice to be able to refocus when you go into another filter. And of course, with a motor like this, you don't need to add and remove the Bahtinov mask. So there's no need to get up or get down, and it focuses on the entire image. I'll be explaining that shortly. And you don't need to slew to a bright star, which is also really nice because it takes time. You're pointing out your target, you want to refocus, so you need to slew to some nearby bright star. Even with plate solving, it takes a little time to do this and then come back again. So with this motor on there, I'm almost at the point where I can ignore focusing. It's just wonderful. Although every once in a while I get a surprise. When I was out this past weekend and I started running, it didn't focus, and I realized, you got to initially get at least a coarse focus. There was enough for a temperature change from the previous night, and I didn't restore my initial setting. It was trying to focus when it was way off, and so that's no good. So I went back to my Bahtinov mask and set a nice, reasonable focus fairly quickly, and then let the algorithm refine it.
Ken, I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but the question came up and it's buzzing around my head. I think you just got to it. You're using Sequence Generator Pro as your focus tool?
Yes.
Okay, I think that answers the question.
Yeah. So this is, here it is, Sequence Generator Pro. So this is on the right is the data that Sequence Generator Pro takes when it focuses. So the graph here on the vertical scale, this is half flux radius. So it's basically the size of a star. And then on the X, on the horizontal axis, you got the position of the focuser. So it takes a variable number of points. When you're out of focus, you have large stars. As you approach the critical focus zone down here, where there's a range of positions which have only minimal improvement in your focus. And then as you go too far, the stars start getting large again. The software works by taking these points and then fitting a curve. It looks like a parabola, fits a parabola through it, finds the minimum, and then it goes in and takes a confirmation point. You can see this one diamond-shaped point. So after taking these 7 points and figuring out where the focus should be, it sets the focuser here, and it takes one more point and makes sure that it's consistent with the the overall pattern of points. So I think I've described that pretty well. I'll move on here. So to get the automatic focusing to work, as I said, you need to have a good starting point. So there's a one-time manual focus, maybe at the beginning of the night, and maybe you don't even have to do it at the beginning of the night if you haven't changed your optical train or moved your focuser a large number of times. The other parameters are all adjustable in the software. I think SGP recommends using 7 points, which is what I do. You can use more, but then, of course, that takes more time, and I'd rather spend my time imaging than focusing. So I end up spending about 2 minutes to acquire those points and refocus. And then the other parameter is the interval between points. So this is another use for the critical focus zone. Once you know your critical focus zone, you kind of know how far you need to move the focuser to change focus. So in my case, I have 120 microns, and I step the focuser by 200 microns. So the distance between points here along the x-axis. Each of these are separated by 200 microns. And then the other parameter is exposure. So you have to take a long enough exposure so that even when you're out of focus, you get a reasonable number of stars. I put the number 10 in here. I'm not sure how correct that is, but I sometimes see about 10 stars at the extreme points on that curve. And I use about 8 seconds exposure for RGB and 4 seconds for luminance. And if you go to narrowband filters, it takes much longer. And there's a fix for that, which I'll mention shortly. And I also use 2x2 binning because, the focal position really doesn't depend upon the binning. And that seems to work fine for me. So by using 2x2 binning, you get better signal to noise. You're more likely to get an accurate star size. And there's also a region of interest feature. So you don't have to use the full frame. You can cut out the border. And I typically use 80 to 90% of the frame for focusing. And then the other aspect of this is focus strategy. Because as I said, you want to minimize your focus time and you want to maximize your imaging time. So how often do you want to focus? Perhaps when filters change, if they're not parfocal, certainly when there's a large temperature change because the scope, the optical tube shrinks, and in fact, the lens itself changes. The curvature of the lens changes, and even the index of refraction of the lens changes. So the focal distance changes during the night. Since I image out in the desert here, 10 degrees C or roughly 20 Fahrenheit change in temperature overnight is quite common, and it makes a big difference to refocus. Okay. Yeah, I end up, the last bullet here, I end up focusing maybe 10 to 15 times per night, which means I'm spending about 95% of the time imaging. And then over here, I wanted to mention these graphs that I'm showing. I didn't really create these graphs. There's a piece of software, and I have it referenced on my last chart. It'll read the Sequence Generator Pro log files and pull out this data. So if you're interested in this level of detail, it's very easy to extract the detailed values from an overnight run. So this graph is a little messy because it combines the focus position versus temperature for several different filters. So you can see the blue dots are a blue filter, the red dots are a red filter, green is green, and the blacks are luminance. So this is, I think this is about 4 hours. This was done in my backyard. This wasn't out in, this was just about a 4-degree change. And this little tool will then calculate for you the temperature compensation coefficient. So you can, one of the parameters in Sequence Generator Pro is to set a value that will automatically change the focus position as temperature changes. So that you can use a thermometer, some sort of temperature sensor, and then use that temperature to calculate where your focus should be and let the software just track temperature changes. So I also do that, but even with that, I tend to refocus whenever I put in a new filter. I know some people sort of worry that reading on cloudy nights, some people seem to worry about where are they getting the temperature from. So that that motor that I bought from Optech has a integrated temperature sensor. So that's convenient, and I just use that. I also have a second temperature sensor associated with a Pegasus power box that I put out near my dew heaters. And so you certainly don't want to use a temperature sensor near your dew heaters for focusing because I'm sure the temperature out by the dew heaters goes up and down as the heaters operate. Another point is that the absolute value of the temperature, I don't think really matters very much. What matters is the change in temperature. So as long as the ambient temperature is not changing very extremely rapidly, and it doesn't change that rapidly, any thermometer, as long as it's not near a dew heater, will kind of track the change in temperature. And you could use that value to determine the change in focus point. You're not going to be able to predict the absolute focus point, but you should be able to track the changes in focus. All right, and then some issues with automated focusing. So if you go to narrowband filters, it takes a really long time because there's so little light getting through them. But there is an offset. So if you focus with one of the narrowband filters once, and you determine the difference between its position, its focus position, and the luminance filter, that value can be set in SGP. And then you would do your focusing with the luminous filter, and the software will then adjust the focus position so your narrowband filter is in focus. This saves a lot of time. Then another problem people have is backlash. I have not seen any backlash with the equipment I have, and it may be that because the step size is so small, that motor has a roughly 1 micron per step. So I have lots of resolution. So it is a mechanical system. I'm sure there's some backlash in the gears, but because there's such high resolution, the backlash doesn't seem to be significant. I have had some failures with automated focusing in high wind, because if the wind is really bad, it's not worth imaging anyway. But what seems to happen is fewer stars are detected, and maybe the width of the stars is not measured very accurately, so you tend to get a lot of scatter on the curve. So here's an example of a curve with scatter of the points. You can see that in this case, the algorithm still worked. Here's the confirmation point, pretty much right at the bottom of the curve. But this is right on the edge of being acceptable. There's SGP has this quality factor of that it defaults to 90%. So if it decides the quality of the fit is worse than 90%, it won't accept it, and it'll try multiple times to focus. I've experienced up to 3 attempts, and at that point it gives up and just restores the previous focus and proceeds with the imaging plan. All right, I realize it's already 7:30. I don't know if I should keep going or not. I probably have another 10 or 15 minutes of charts.
Well, it's somewhat up to you. We start losing our audience about now. At some point here, we can easily handle another 10 or 15 minutes. Before we do that, though, earlier I promised Brandon Tackett could say something about what's coming up next week. Brandon, would you like to do that? Take a minute now if you need to go.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So I will actually be talking about the RASA 8 or Roe Ackerman Schmidt astrograph, and just tagging along to what Ken is talking about. Critical focus zone is incredibly important when you're shooting at f2. So I will hint on it, not nearly to the depth that Ken's been talking, but this is very important in any circumstance. And I'll talk about a lot of other things regarding the RASA 8 and my journey through astrophotography over the last year and a half. So hope to see you guys next week. Okay, I'm sorry to have kept you waiting there, but I just I get a little scatterbrained, as you probably all know by now. Thank you very much, Ken. As far as your answer goes, I gave you a few minutes to think about what you want to do. If you've got another 10 or 15 minutes, go for it. That's not going to be any longer than we usually do. If you've got another half hour, hey, schedule us up for again later.
Well,
Eric,
what I'll do is I'll go through this at an accelerated pace to make sure I get through it.
Okay, and if you get enough questions between now and then, we can have you back. We can always reschedule people. Okay, so go ahead.
Okay. So At the center of the critical focus zone, you get this blurry star. You don't see the airy disk because of atmospheric turbulence. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that. The pictures here on the right, this upper one was generated by PixInsight. This is what a star looks like. We're used to looking at pictures and we see the brightness of the star, but you can also represent the brightness as a number plotted vertically above the focal plane. So that's what this is. The stars are these very sharp little cones that stick up above the noise level. You can see other fairly dim little bumps here. Those are relatively dim stars. And if you happen to image an even brighter star, the top of this cone will be flat because you've saturated the pixels. But assuming you haven't saturated a pixel, you can then also in PixInsight, you can ask it, what is the full width half maximum of this? So this is another representation of a star. Here we're looking at a cross section through this cone, and indicated here is the full width half maximum. It's the full width of the curve at half the maximum. And so you can see here 2.39 pixels. That's fairly typical of what I see at 1.5 arc seconds per pixel. So you can see that's maybe 3.6 arc seconds. So one way of measuring seeing, which I'm starting to pay more attention to, is to take a 1 second image. You don't want to do a very long image because then you start getting tracking and vibration problems. So you kind of want to do it fairly short. And then just do this curve fit, and you'll at least get some data to see what you're seeing actually is on a particular night. All right, I'd like to show, probably people have seen twinkling stars, but just for the hell of it, I took my guide scope and I put it on my main scope. My guide camera, and I put it on my main scope. The guide camera is a video, and it's much faster than the CCD. So I hope that video is coming through. You can see the star dancing around. So this is what stars really do. They aren't these bright spots. They're these scattered little dots of light that dance left and right all over the place. This was taken at about 5 milliseconds per exposure. So it's a very bright star. I think it's Sirius, actually. I'll try to see if I can stop that. And maybe minimize that. And then I go back to slideshow. Okay. So that's what really look like. And the brighter dots are known as speckles. There was a talk several months ago on the Astro Imaging channel about speckle interferometry, I think, that takes advantage of those little bright spots to measure the spacing between double stars. And I like this little quote, but in short, because we're short on time, I'm not going to read it. Now, this is a very busy chart, but I think it's a very nice chart, and it kind of shows what's going on. Why do the stars dance around like that? If you recall, one of my first charts, I showed a plane wavefront approaching the telescope, and so that's what we have here. But when you pass through the atmosphere, there are these regions of low temperature and high temperature, or high density and low density atmosphere, which means that the index of refraction of the atmosphere is changing. And the atmosphere in itself acts kind of like a lens, but it's a very strange lens, the lens that's always changing and bending and tilting. And what it does to the wavefront is it creates this very complicated shape down here. Some small sections of the wavefront are aligned, and so the light rays come together and form these bright spots, which are speckles. When you create an image, you're averaging over all this stuff, and you just get that blob. If you happen to have a small scope, that's what this is illustrating here, a small aperture, you don't see all these features. You see a limited amount of variation. In a small scope, you may actually see the airy disk. And of course, the airy disk itself is larger when the aperture is smaller. But as you get to a larger aperture, you're going to pick up more and more of this variation in the wavefront, and you're going to see that speckle pattern that I showed. Also interesting down here, there's this chart of seeing versus, this is from a model of turbulence in the atmosphere. R0, this is maybe getting rather technical. R0 is called the Fried parameter, or the spatial coherence length. It's the distance over which there's a significant change in the wavefront. So if the Fried parameter is smaller than the diameter of your scope, you're in a situation like this, where you're going to see an airy disk, or your stars will be diffraction limited. But once your centimeters, and so I'm using a 100-centimeter scope, all seems to tie together and make sense. I should not see an airy disk. I should see this dancing star. Okay, so I'm getting very close to finishing here. I kind of have a concluding chart that when I think about all this, it sort of amazes me that we can take photographs at all, that you got this extremely bright star out there. The light travels through, trillions of miles, thousands of light years. We collect such a tiny, tiny fraction of the original light. The light gets Doppler shifted. It gets distorted by the Earth's atmosphere. We collect it with an imperfect lens, which further distorts it with all kinds of optical aberrations, which of course a good lens minimizes, but they're still there. It then gets converted to electrons in a CCD by the photoelectric effect. We have software that presents it to our eye after it's been stretched and processed, and then our mind somehow interprets what we see. So that's a lot going on. And when telescopes were first invented, interpreting what is seen was actually very controversial. There was a lot of argument about what Galileo saw in his telescope and what it meant. But in spite of all that, it's still possible for us to take pretty images, and sometimes images of scientific value. And I think I have a lot of fun doing it. So that's it. Anyone home?
Yep, we're here.
Okay.
Yeah, that was awesome. I like the bringing in some of the more scientific side of it, because I think that the mechanics of it kind of eludes people. So thanks for laying that out.
Yeah, and I have showing, if someone is interested, this last chart has some links to where I got some of this information.
Thank you, Ken. And by the way, for those of you who are watching out there, we all sit here without our microphones and cameras on because it just cuts down on the bandwidth and things like that. And so if somebody asks us a question right out there, it takes us a second to drop everything, reach up, click on the microphone so that we can speak and things like that. So that's where we are. We are actually here. We're slow to get back to everybody. Eric, how are we doing on questions? Have we gotten through everybody?
I think we got to everyone's question. There's been a lot of back and forth discussion about filter offsets or individual filters. And I think that we've all come to conclusions that we're correct, even if we disagree. It was an interesting comment that you made, Ken about shooting through the atmosphere. I do a little lucky imaging with a 5,000 millimeter scope, and I can tell you that you get lots of turbulence no matter what, even with very long focal lengths and very small areas. If you look at the sun and doing a live image, it is jumping all over the place, even under the best of conditions. So I've yet to ever see where the stars are perfectly steady, or any image is perfectly steady, regardless of focal length. But I'm waiting for that day.
Yeah. Okay.
Ken, I'd like to share a few points. You said you had 10-second downloads. I'd kill for that. Mine's somewhere in the 37 to 40-second download per frame on my old STL. But you can crop it, which will speed things up dramatically, and
Right.
use offsets as well. I'm a very big advocate for offsets. With the temperature probes, what I had done in the past with a very fast focal length telescope is I put a temperature probe inside of a sleeve. So if I slewed directions in the sky, I wouldn't pick up huge temperature changes, because if it's under the scope or on top of the scope, it could be quite a different temperature. And I use temperature as the dictator when I determine a focus change. So for every degree of temperature change, my scope changed its length enough to knock it out of critical focus. So I would use that purely as a dictator of when I should do the next focus run. Might be something to consider. The scope I have now, that doesn't be true, but back then, a very short focal length instrument, that was a big difference.
Yeah,
And
I do that also. I mean, I have that temperature compensation number set in Sequence Generator Pro, so it's also tracking temperature change.
Yeah, I only use it as a predictor when to focus. I
I
wasn't
see.
there, yeah, because it's not linear on a temperature.
I see.
Yeah, so no telescope is actually linear with temperature change. There's too many different materials.
Well, again, my limited experience, it seems to be sufficiently linear that I stay within the critical focus on.
Okay, and there you mentioned about placing a filter. I tried finding it, and I'm sorry, but I failed. But I had a pin diagram that when you're trying to put a corrector in your imaging train, and you look at the astigmatisms on the corners, they would change to, say, a horizontal to a vertical shape.
Yes.
You could actually use that to determine where the corrector should be placed. It would find I'm inside or outside.
Yes.
I couldn't find the photo. I'm sorry.
Yes, I have seen that also. In fact, I at one point I tried to measure it that way by moving back and forth and trying to see that. But for whatever reason, I don't really see much change. Even as I was trying to say, even if I go way outside, so I'm either doing something wrong, or in my particular configuration, there's just a very big window of acceptable distance.
It could be the size of the chip, perhaps, like on a very large CCD chip. That
certainly would be
terrible.
Yeah. Well, this is what is it? The 8300, the KAF 8300. So it's a 4/3.
Yeah, big difference between that and a large chip. There's
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Ken, could you stop sharing your screen so we can see you when you talk?
Oh, sure. Sorry.
Yeah, well, that's okay. It happens.
Okay.
There was some discussion about which program has the world's best focusing routines. I think that there's that discussion has been going on for quite some time. So I don't know if it ever will get an official answer. But plenty of people have been using various focusing routines, and they're quite serviceable, whatever they are. But getting the electronic focuser, as you said, the stepper motor focuser that you talked about, is certainly an advantage because it allows so much more automation of what you want to do. So have we got everything, Eric? Are you looking at all the questions over there?
Yeah, again, there's a lot of back and forth. I think, trying to decide which focusing routine is best, or whether the off-axis guider or the separate guide scope or the on-axis guider, I think that discussion and argument will never end.
Mm-hmm. Okay, So that's going to wrap up for tonight, and we're getting ready for Brandon for next week, and he'll show you why. As was pointed out earlier, the critical focus zone changes dramatically when you change focal ratio. And Ken here was talking about what was the 6.7 or whatever your focal ratio was for his stellar view scope. But when you put it on a RASA or other hyperstar type camera, you're going to be talking about f2. And that critical focus zone shrinks dramatically. Everything has to be done better. So with that in mind, I think it's about time to turn it back to Molly. Molly, you ready to take over?
All righty, I will take us out. Thanks again, Ken, and see everybody next week. Good night, all.
Good night.